Can you really build a stand-up paddleboard with common lumber purchased from Lowe's or Home Depot? Well, I've built quite a few flat-bottom boats that way, so I don't see why not, but admittedly, this will be my first attempt to build a stand-up paddleboard. I've spent some time paddling a basic inflatable board on Kentucky Lake, and it's a lot of fun if you have decent balance. But inflatables are not the best performing boards. They're soft and squishy, which makes them slower and less responsive. They're usually very thick, around 6 inches, which results in a high center of gravity and a corky feel. They just kind of feel unstable because you're standing so high above the surface of the water. And of course, with inflatables, there's always the chance of getting a puncture. Not fun. Inflatable boards are great for their lightweight, portability, and relative affordability, but hard boards are by far the better performers in almost every way. A good hard board is usually very expensive, but with my experience building small sailing and rowing boats, I figure I can probably get away with building my own SUP out of wood for maybe a couple $100 or so. In this video, I'll apply my folk boat building method to design and build my own 11'8" stand-up paddleboard. As with my small boat builds, I'll be using only very simple materials. Dimensional lumber and common exterior plywood from Lowe's. The board will be assembled with deck screws, construction adhesive, and a bit of wood glue. To protect the hull, I'll apply a few coats of acrylic house paint, the same stuff I use on all my wooden boats, believe it or not. And finally, when the build is complete, we'll head down to the lake to see if my homemade board is actually any good. As the build progresses, I'll be sharing all relevant dimensions on screen. This will allow builders at home to replicate my design or adapt my method to build a similar board. You can consider this build video a set of free plans. It includes all the information needed to build my paddleboard. But if you'd prefer to have all the dimensions laid out in black and white, you can download my hand-drawn shop notes from CumberlandRover.com. The shop notes are just a simplified form of plans that include all dimensions you need to know, plus sketches of framing and components. You can download the shop notes linked in the description below. The link will take you to my site, where you'll also find plans for my various sailing boats, rowing boats, and paddlecraft, built in a similar style to this board. Now let's get on with the build. Starting with a pair of 1x4 by 12 foot cedar boards, I begin the shaping process. These boards will form the sides of the hull, much the way I build my flat-bottom boats. Most of my boats are built by bending sideboards around a single mold in the center, and screwing and gluing the sides to stem and stern pieces. This paddleboard will be built similarly, but I'm using 2 molds instead of 1. This helps preserve width throughout the board's length. Or in other words, it keeps the nose and tail from getting too skinny too fast. Plenty of surface area is required to give the board enough buoyancy. And as long as my board has adequate buoyancy and stability, it should at the very least be functional, even if other characteristics end up lacking. So at a bare minimum, I'll try not to screw up those 2 things, buoyancy and stability. At this beginning stage of the build, the assembly is only temporarily secured as I adjust the clamps to shape the board's outline. This step is really just a continuation of my design process. I've made some sketches beforehand and already have a good idea of the style of board I want. It'll be long and pointy, just under 12 foot, 33 inches wide at its widest point, and slightly rounded on the bottom and on deck. During this shaping phase, I'm mainly trying to determine the width of the tail, as well as the general outline of the board. A tail too narrow will reduce buoyancy and stability, and a tail too wide is just kind of ugly to look at. Since my board has a narrow pointed nose, I have to be extra careful not to give up too much width near the tail. Once I'm satisfied with the overall shape, I'll be ready to start building individual parts of the hull before moving on to assembly. I'll use this temporary mock-up of the board to take measurements for parts like the nose piece, tail, and ribs. Satisfied with the general shape, I begin making parts, starting with the tail. The trapezoid-shaped tailpiece is sawn from a 1x6 cedar board. The forward face is 16¼ inch and the aft end is 14½. I cut 3 of these parts identically on the chop saw. The table is rotated to about 9½ degrees when making these cuts. If you'd rather just keep it super simple, you can leave the tail flat, but I'm going with a fishtail shape for a little surf style flair. I just think it looks cool. These curves are drawn with a flexible ruler to be cut later on, after the frame is assembled. Remember, my sideboards are still in a temporary holding configuration as I work out the details of my framing. If you're following along with your own build at home, there's no need for this shaping step. Again, it's just part of the design process. I just thought it'd be interesting to show. All you have to do to build a board like this is first make all your parts, your nose, tail, ribs, stringer, etc., and then assemble. Now I glue the 3 identical trapezoids together, back to back, in order to form a single tailpiece. If you want to draw that fish shape, make sure the piece with the curves drawn on it is on the top of the stack so you can see it. Titan Tight Bond 3 is my wood glue of choice. It's very strong and completely waterproof. The parts should be clamped tightly for at least an hour, but longer is always better. Wood screws alone should provide enough clamping force, but it's also not a bad idea to clamp the assembly to your work table for a while. So the tail is complete. Now I need something to join my sideboards at the nose. On the chop saw, I cut a small trapezoid from the same cedar 1x6. It's 2½ on the forward edge and 6¾ on the aft edge. The saw's table is angled about 22 degrees to make these cuts. On a boat, this part would be called a breast hook. It ties the sideboards together at the nose and will be concealed inside the hull. Next, I produce a simple wedge to plug up the nose where the sideboards meet. This part would be a lot easier to rip on a table saw, but since my dad happens to be borrowing my table saw, I make do with slightly more primitive means. You see, my dad and I have an informal tool sharing system. The way the system works is we just kind of take whatever we want from each other's shops and then ask to get it back later. This part looks a lot like the stem of a boat, but it's really just a filler piece to keep water out of the nose, with no real structural significance. Viewed from the end grain, it's a triangle measuring 1 3/4 on the outer sides and 1 1/2 at the base. The saw blade is angled 22 degrees, and that would also go if you were going to rip this piece out on a table saw, which is a much easier way to do it. With the tail, nose piece, and nose plug finished, it's time to make some ribs. This is the longest and most tedious part of the build, but it's very important. The ribs form the structural bones of our board and shape the side-to-side curve of the bottom and deck. I'm cutting mine from 1/2 inch by 5 1/2 inch cedar fence pickets. You can find these at Lowe's, and they're super light, rot resistant, and dirt cheap. 3/8 or 1/2 inch plywood could also be an option to make ribs, but it may be a little heavier and probably won't hold a screw as well as solid cedar. I begin by cutting each of the 9 ribs to length on the chop saw. Note that the 2 molds are also ribs and are a permanent part of the frame. When it comes to most of my small boat designs, the mold is usually a temporary fixture that gets removed, but in this case, the molds are permanent. Each rib has the same gentle curve cut on top. This gives the deck a slight crown to increase volume and prevent water from pooling up on deck. The bottom has a similar shape, but is actually dead flat for a section near the keel line, a section of about 12 inches, and then curves upwards to meet the sideboards. I scribe the curve with my flexible ruler and cut it with a jigsaw. The 5 ribs in the middle of the board, which include both molds, all have a 1/2 inch crown, top and bottom. This means the ribs extend a 1/2 inch above and below the sideboards at their midpoint. These 5 main ribs spanning from mold to mold will be spaced 1 foot apart. The remaining ribs beyond the molds gradually descend in height to meet the nose and tail. The ribs will be tied together with a 1 1/4 inch by 3/4 stringer running the length of the deck. So each rib should be notched on the deck side to accept this stringer. Finally, all ribs need notches on the bottom and upper corners to allow water to drain if the board happens to leak. I'll be installing a garboard style drain when my board is complete. Stability is obviously one of the most important aspects of a paddleboard, so I was careful not to overdo it with the curve of the bottom and deck. Most general use boards, especially for beginners, are flat on deck and flat on the bottom, except for a little bit of rocker or upward curve to the nose. The last thing you want is a board that just wants to roll side to side badly. The main reason I opted for the side-to-side contour is to increase overall volume and therefore increase buoyancy of the board. Remember, a commercial 1x4 is actually just 3.5 inches wide, and I need a little more thickness than that for my board. With an added 1/2 inch crown on both sides of the board, bottom and deck, plus the 1/4 inch thickness of the plywood skin on both sides, the maximum thickness of my board ends up being 5 inches near the center line in the middle of the board, tapering to 4 inches at the rails. I figure this should be plenty of volume to float me and my lunch while still maintaining a low center of gravity and avoiding the quirkiness of inflatable boards. I'm fully aware that a lower board will not be as dry as a thicker one, but I'm okay with getting some water over the deck in a chop. So here are the 5 most important ribs in the center of the board with the length and position of each labeled. M4 is the forwardmost mold, positioned 4 foot from the nose before the sides are bent, and M8 is the aftmost mold, positioned 8 foot from the nose, or 4 foot from the tail. Ribs 5, 6, and 7 are located 1 foot apart between the molds. Ribs beyond the molds in either direction gradually descend in height, tapering down to meet each end of the board. Now that I have all the most important components sawn out and finished, it's time for assembly. So I tear down the shaping setup and return to square one. What I've got now is my pair of cedar 1x4 by 12 foot sideboards laid out on sawhorses. When building any of my small boat designs, I usually recommend assembling the hull on a strong back, secured to the shop floor if possible. A strong back is basically just a big wooden frame used to support the build. But for a paddleboard, sawhorses are really all you need, just to raise the build up to a comfortable height. You don't want to be working doubled over all the time. It's really not good for the back, and you'll need a good back for paddling. If you're using lumberyard cedar stock as I am, chances are one side will have a rough texture. It's a good idea to sand that side, just smooth enough to take paint. If you can't justify the cost of cedar, pine will work just fine for sideboards. It'll be a bit heavier, but it'll also be a lot cheaper. After sanding, I mark the 2 mold locations on the inner face of both sideboards. I make one mark 4 foot from the nose and one mark 4 foot from the tail. Before fastening the molds in, there's one more step. I need to cut the nose and tail of my sideboards to shape. The nose is cut to the dimensions pictured here. This gives it a tiny bit of rocker on the bottom and a bit of forward rake. The tail gets a bit more rocker, just in order for the sideboards to meet the tailpiece. After pre-drilling 2 holes at each marked location, I fasten in the molds with number 10 by 3-inch deck screws. Pre-drilling and countersinking should be standard practice for driving screws on a board or boat, especially when you're driving one near the edge of a board. You don't want to split it out. Again, the molds are screwed in 4 feet from each end of the sideboards, and each mold is 28 1/2 inches long. Mold 4 and mold 8 share the same dimensions, but there's a difference in how each is installed. This has to do with how the plywood skin will be laid, and this will make more sense when you see it later on. Mold 4 is set even with the deck at the top, leaving a 1/2 inch gap at the bottom. Mold 8 is just the opposite. It's set even with the bottom, and a 1/2 inch gap is left near the deck. This 1/2 inch gap on both molds will allow a horizontal board to be installed later. That board is needed to reinforce joints in the plywood skin and is known as a butt block. Now for the fun part. I'm ready to start bending in the sides to meet the tail and nose pieces. The sideboards are actually a lot more flexible than you might think, and actually bend pretty easily. If you don't have big enough clamps like mine, a pair of ratchet straps will do. But honestly, for this build, you may even get away with bending by hand if you have an assistant or two to compress the boards as you fasten the nose and tail. But in my opinion, large clamps are the best way to go and well worth the investment. You can never have too many clamps in a shop. Starting with the tail, I pre-drill and countersink all screw holes and lay down a bead of Loctite PL Premium. Then it's just a matter of drawing in the boards with my big clamp and lining up the tail carefully. I fasten it with number 10 by 3-inch deck screws and look for the PL to squirt out the joint. That's how you know you got it good and tight, as the Germans say. Remember, it's gotta be Loctite PL Premium. It's amazingly strong stuff, and I use it to build all my boats. You want standard PL that comes out tan. I would avoid the fast grab version that comes out gray. Just stick with regular PL Premium. At the nose, I have roughly the same task as the tail, but it's a much bigger bend. It can be somewhat of a struggle drawing the bow together and getting the nose piece to fit just right. When it finally lines up, I secure the nose with number 10 by 3-inch deck screws. Driving a couple of temporary traction screws, as seen here, makes a world of difference when trying to use clamps on an angled surface like the bow or nose of a boat or board. Prospective builders should take note of this trick, even for my other boat designs like the Solo P-Row and Pelican Pun. I wish I had figured it out sooner, but better late than never, I guess. Also, don't forget you can accomplish the bend using ratchet straps, but in my opinion, clamps are the better option. When the ends of the sideboards touch, I install the nose plug with PL and a couple finish screws per side. The nose may not look pretty now, but that all gets sorted out with the sander later on. With the outline of the board complete, I now have 6 additional ribs to install, beginning with the 3 in the middle, each spaced 1 foot apart. This is the part of the board that supports your weight, so it has to be sturdy. When the longitudinal stringer is installed later on, it'll be even sturdier. With the board turned over, I install the first butt block where the 2 sections of plywood skin will meet on the bottom. Because my board is 11 foot 8 and plywood is only sold in 8 foot sheets, there must be a joint, a longer section of planking and a smaller one, with a joint in the middle. This butt block fits into the space left below mold 4 to reinforce the joint and help to keep it watertight. The same goes for the joint in the deck planking, but that joint is located near the tail at mold 8 to avoid having the bottom and deck joints fall on the same rib, which would weaken the hull overall. In other words, the bottom and deck joints are staggered. I install rib 9, 12 inches aft of mold 8, and rib 10, 12 inches aft of rib 9. After installing the final 2 ribs at the nose section, which are just evenly spaced, it's almost time to lay bottom planking. It's almost time to lay bottom planking. First, I just have to finish up the fishtail. Cutting carefully with my trusty old jigsaw, I do my best to blend the curve of the tail around the sideboards. After a preliminary shaping of the nose, it's time to bring in the plywood bottom planking. This is 1/4 inch BCX plywood from Lowe's, exterior ply. It's made with waterproof glue, tends not to have too many voids, and is pretty dang durable based on my experience. I've used it to build many small boats and put a lot of miles on some of those boats. The one problem in this case is that it's just a little on the heavy side for something as small as a paddleboard. I think it'll work just fine, but there's no doubt most of the weight of this board is going to be in the plywood skins. The frame itself will only end up to be around 20 pounds. Planking the bottom is simple enough. You just line up the end of the plywood centered on the butt block, temporarily screw or clamp it down, trace the shape of the hole from underneath, and cut it out with a jigsaw. Before permanently installing the bottom, I trace all rib locations from inside the hull and drill pilot holes based on these lines. This just makes it a lot easier to drive screws into the ribs accurately once the bottom is on. An accidental miss with a screw results in a hole in the bottom, not what you want, though if that happens, the hole can be filled, of course, and I usually use leftover PL Premium for that. After laying down a bead of PL Premium along the rails, I fasten the bottom with number 8 by 1 5/8 deck screws. I space my screws roughly 4 to 5 inches apart. It's a pain, but countersinking all these holes is worthwhile because screw heads sticking out of the bottom of a boat or board can be annoying. They'll also wear out your sandpaper a lot faster when prepping for paint. The nose section goes on just the same, butting up the second sheet of ply to the first at the butt block, tracing it, and securing it with screws and glue after it's cut out. You'll notice about an 1/8 to a 1/16 inch of ply hanging out beyond the sideboard. I cut the planking a little oversized this way on purpose and trim it up with power planer and sander. To me, it just ends up looking cleaner than trying to cut it exact with the saw. With the board turned upright, I move on to building the fin box. You could buy one of those plastic commercial stick-on ones, but I like the idea of building my own, and I have what may be a fairly unique approach to this problem. My idea is to build the fin box just like a daggerboard slot on a sailing dinghy. The fin will fit in a slot cut in the deck and bottom. The only real difference is that it'll be located near the tail instead of the middle of the boat, as on a daggerboard slot. To me, this way is a lot more convenient than going with the stick-on fin, because it allows you to remove or swap your fin out quickly and easily without having to flip the board over or dig around underneath the tail while the board's in the water. Plus, it'll also allow me to easily build and test my own different fins if I want to. If you don't know, the main purpose of a fin is to keep a board tracking straight when paddling, without one SUPs just tend to turn and spin all over the place, and it's really hard to make them go straight. In very shallow water, the fin can be removed or swapped for a little stubby one. I saw the sides of my fin box from the same 1/2-inch cedar fence picket stock. The long pieces are 18 1/8 by 5 1/2, and the short pieces are 5 by 5 1/2. 5 1/2 is the actual width of the cedar fence pickets. The box will have a 1/2-inch by 8-inch slot, and I plan on making my fin from 1/4-inch ply. Before assembling, I paint the inside of the slot to prevent the wood from absorbing water, just because it'll be difficult to access after the box is assembled. I assemble with Titan Tight Bond wood glue and 1 5/8 screws. The box will be located directly behind the last rib. With a big yardstick, I trace what will be the slope of the deck. The box will be trimmed to match this slope and will end up sandwiched between the bottom and deck, with a slot cut through each, allowing the fin just to drop right through the board. The lower edge of the box gets a healthy dose of PL Premium to hopefully seal any leaks, and it should do. And then screws are driven through the bottom into the edge of the box, and you really want to make sure to draw it down tight. The fin box has to be tight, and these are prone to leaking. Before moving on to building the deck, I flip the board over to finish sanding the bottom. The overhanging plywood edges are trimmed and the hull sanded smooth. You'll never get a show finish with plain old BCX pine plywood, so it's probably not worth putting too much effort into your sanding and bodywork here. I hit the roughest spots with 80 grit on my belt sander, and then finish by hand sanding with 180. The lower edge of the rail just gets rounded off. Now at this point, you're probably expecting me to skin out the deck just like I did the bottom with 1/4-inch plywood. But looking at this photo, something is clearly amiss. We've got plywood just in the middle and blank sections on either end. Now what's all this about? Well, after turning the board over, I'm starting to think, man, this thing is ending up to be a little heavier than I'd really like it to be. As mentioned, the plywood skin is the heaviest part of the board. The frame itself is only 19.6 pounds. Yes, I weighed it. I still think it'll work just fine, but I know a board is a lot more sensitive to weight than a boat is, and I'm doing my best to maximize performance with this design. At least as much as I can according to my budget and the materials available. So a radical idea occurs to me. I know I need a good solid structure in the middle of the deck where I stand. That section will have to be 1/4-inch plywood, but the ends just have to support a few gear items at most, like maybe a small cooler and my skimboard. And yes, I skimboard in western Kentucky on some of the sandbars. Those small gear items will be supported well enough by the stringer alone. So I remembered that I had a couple yards of heavy canvas left over from a previous project, and I thought, what if the deck was plywood in the middle and canvas at the nose and tail? Omitting that much plywood would make a noticeable difference in weight and performance. And so that's what I decided to do. Kind of a weird idea, but I think it just might work. The nose and tail sections of the deck will be covered in canvas. I also happen to have a bunch of styrofoam insulation board left over from a skimboard build, so I decided to put that to good use as well as reserve flotation inside the hull. I don't have enough to fill the entire volume of the board, but I think I've got enough to keep the board from sinking if it were to develop a very serious leak. The foam will be mainly concentrated in the nose and tail where the canvas goes. Now my radical idea begins to take shape. It's time to cut the canvas decks. This is 12-ounce Durawax cotton duck. It's basically a heavy cotton canvas infused with beeswax, or something similar to beeswax. It's not intended to be used for boat skins or long-term outdoor exposure, but I've made and tested many different bags and cushion covers out of this stuff, and I have a pretty good idea of what it can do, and I have some confidence in it. The haversack I often carry on my sailing adventures is made of this same stuff. As long as it's waxed, it's plenty waterproof, and the fabric is very durable. My expectation is that this board is low slung enough that the deck will probably be pretty wet at both ends on anything but dead flat water. So it'll be interesting to see how this canvas performs in such conditions. I'm convinced it'll work, but if not, I always have the option of reverting to plywood. With the main deck and canvas ends cut out, I have finally reached the finishing stage. First I fill all screw holes and sand everything smooth. And then I lay down a couple coats of paint inside the hull. This is just to prevent the wood from absorbing too much water if at some point it develops a leak. Maybe you're noticing a theme there, that I have concerns about the development of a leak, and you've got to consider leaks when building any sort of craft that's sealed up like this, where you don't have easy access to the inside. You need a way to get water out and also a means of ventilation. My foam panels are glued to the bottom and to each other with PL. It's true they would be adequately captured by the decks alone, but I'd just rather not have to listen to foam rustling around as I paddle or whenever I handle the board, so I decided to glue them firmly in place. Before the deck goes on, I installed the 3/4 by 1 1/4 pine stringer. This stringer provides extra support for the deck and stiffens the board by tying all the ribs together and tying all that together with the skins. The stringer runs from the nose piece all the way to the fin slot. It does take a little coaxing to get it to fit the rib slots, so it's probably best to cut these slots just slightly oversized. The trick to getting a perfect fit on the canvas sections is this little strip of 1/4-inch ply running side to side. The canvas will pass over this strip and tuck under the center plywood deck. This clamps the fabric tightly and should keep water out. It also creates a seamless visual transition between the ply and canvas. So you can see I have my plywood center deck painted, and apparently matching paint to fabric isn't an exact science. I took a scrap of my canvas in to Home Depot to be digitally matched, and you can see it didn't turn out quite right. I kind of figured that might be the case, but it's close enough, I guess. The brown paint on the deck and the white paint on the hull are both Bare Ultra from Home Depot, an exterior acrylic house paint. I use this stuff on all my home-built boats, and it works great on a trailer boat in fresh water. It's best to go with a gloss or semi-gloss sheen for this type of project. High sheen makes a huge difference in repelling water and just makes the hull easier to clean. Because I anticipate removing the deck at some point if the canvas doesn't work out, I'll caulk it with silicone instead of using PL. The silicone can be cut and scraped off, but PL is permanent. 1/2-inch batten strips on 3 sides of the canvas clamp the fabric tightly to the board. This compresses the canvas slightly and should create a fairly watertight seal. That's the theory, at least. We'll see how it goes. A garber drain is installed in the sideboard near the aft end of the center deck. You definitely want a drain of some sort on anything fully decked like this. Water will eventually find its way in, regardless of how tight you think you built the boat. And you need some way to get that water out, and also some way to vent the inside of the boat. I built this simple hooked fin out of 1/4-inch plywood. You just cut out the shape with a jigsaw and attach a couple of battens at the top to keep the fin from falling through the slot. My fin is 7 1/4 wide at the top and 11 inches deep. I thought I'd try a little surf style striping with the same white paint used on the hull. If you want to make stripes with crisp lines, you need special fine line tape. It's really hard to do with ordinary masking tape. I tested paint on a scrap of the wax canvas, and surprisingly, it actually stuck pretty well. I can't explain that because I wouldn't think paint would stick to wax, but somehow it sticks well enough, so I'll take it. Regular viewers may recognize this navy color from my 12-foot sail and door skiff and the 16-foot Pelican punt. And yes, I am using a roller like a giant crayon. Alright, this is it, my paddle board in its final form. It's 11 foot 8 by 33 inches and 5 inches thick at the center line in the middle of the board and 4 inches at the rails. The final weight is just over 50 pounds. It took a couple of weeks and just under $300 to complete, and I think it looks pretty doggone sharp. But the question is, of course, does my homemade paddleboard actually work? As they say on YouTube, let's find out. First, I test the board without the fin just to see how she goes. Paddleboards never track straight without the fin down, especially not when they're being paddled by an amateur like myself. But I just wanted to start without the fin just as a baseline. Right away, I can tell the board is stable and it sits just about right in the water. Really about like I expected. It has plenty of buoyancy, but a much lower center of gravity than my inflatable board, and that's what I was going for. The trough-shaped bottom provides noticeable reserve stability as the board heels to one side, so that feature is a success. I do notice a lack of traction on the deck, but that can be remedied with a little surf wax or by gluing on thin strips of wood for grip, perhaps. Personally, I'll probably just wax it. I will also say that the half-inch crown on deck may be a wee bit too much of a curve. I don't feel like I'm gonna slide right off or anything, but a gentler quarter-inch crown might be better. With the fin down, she tracks straight as an arrow, and that long water line and minimal nose rocker means she's capable of some speed actually. This is my first time paddling a hardboard, and it feels great. She's solid underfoot and responsive. Glide is noticeably improved over my 10'6" inflatable, and this is partially just due to the increased length and lack of rocker, but also due to improved stiffness over the squishy board. As the wind picks up during my test run, a micro chop develops, and this reveals my board's greatest weakness. Yes, your feet get wet on anything but dead flat water, but you know what? I don't really mind that. It's a worthwhile trade-off for the lowered center of gravity. The biggest downside of my design is lack of nose rocker. The nose just kind of plows waves if there are any waves. It's really the drop from center deck to nose that causes this. There's rocker on the bottom, but the deck is actually convex. This is really just the result of the limitations of my chosen materials. To make the nose more upswept as a whole, you would have to get the sides out of wider boards, like 1x6s or maybe even 1x8s. And this would increase cost significantly, especially if you're working with cedar, and would also result in a lot of wasted wood. On the other hand, flatter rocker is actually great on flat water. It improves speed and tracking. So I guess this is more of a flat water board. It can handle some little waves just fine, but you'll definitely get some water over the deck. In my opinion, that's okay. In conclusion, I'd say my homemade stand-up paddle board built with wood from the lumberyard is a success, and I'm pretty happy with what I built. If I built another one, the one thing I might change is to add true nose rocker to improve performance in choppy conditions, actually making the whole nose to be upswept a couple inches or so. I will caution prospective builders that this is probably not a beginner's paddleboard due to the contour of the bottom and crown of the deck. My board has great reserve stability, but its initial stability is much less than a board that's dead flat on both sides. Reserve stability just means the board can wobble side to side a bit, but when it leans over hard to one side, the side of that trough shape kicks in to stabilize the hull, preventing it from rolling way over. If you want to replicate my design, but don't want to mess with canvas, I think the board will work just fine skinning the deck completely in 1/4-inch plywood. The total weight of my board was 53 pounds. So with the added ply, it may be something like 65 plus pounds, and this will vary with the specific materials that you use. On the ends, in place of canvas, you could also consider using a product called Revolution Ply. It's lightweight, 1/8-inch bamboo plywood. The only problem is that it's not recommended for exterior use. And I don't know how waterproof the glue is, if at all. However, I have used Rev Ply on an experimental boat and a skimboard, and as long as you keep it painted, I think it could be a viable option for decking, depending on how permanent of a board you're trying to build. So that about does it for this build. If you enjoyed the video, consider checking out my mini small boat builds in the boat building playlist here on the Cumberland Rover channel. I've built a couple of sail and oar skiffs, a 12-foot P-row, 16-foot decked canoe, an 8-foot pram, and even a couple skimboards. You'll find all those build videos in my boat building playlist. And I even offer plans for many of my designs on cumberlandrover.com. If you want to replicate the board from this video, head on over to cumberlandrover.com and download my hand-drawn shop notes. Again, the shop notes are just a simplified, more affordable version of my plans that will get you going on your own board. Plans for my best designs, like the 12-foot Crooked Creek skiff, include professional CAD drawings and step-by-step written instructions. Publishing my hand-drawn shop notes just allows me to bring you the information more quickly and more affordably. So check out the shop notes as well as my various small boat plans linked in the description below. Thanks for your support, and thanks for watching.